Hey, what's up guys? It's Pedro here from noobcoder.com and welcome back to part 3 of my tutorial series on building a type racing clone. And in this tutorial, we're going to be covering everything that has to do with creating a game within our type racing clone. Alright, so to get started, we're going to need to connect to our socketio server. So we already installed socketio on the server side. We're going to need to do it on the client side. So let's bring up the terminal. And I'm going to clear it. Next, we need to change into the client directory. That's important. That's where we keep all our front end stuff. And I'm just going to type npm install socket.io client. All right, so that's done. Let's exit out of that. Let us bring up the package explorer. We're going to create a file. So go within client source directory. And we're going to right click the source directory, new file, and we're going to call this socket config. Okay, so now let's exit this. And now this is where we're going to set up our connection for our socket. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to import from the socket.io client. Next, what we're going to do is actually connect to our server. So const socket is going to be equal to io, and then where our server is located. So HTTP localhost, and we gave it a port of 3001. Next, we're just going to export this so we could use this within our components. Okay, so let's save this and let's actually test this out. So let's go back to our app.js. Let us import it. And let us actually use it. So I'm going to bring in the use effect hook. So let's come up here, use effect. And you'll see why in a second. So we're going to say use effect. And we'll just pass an empty array. So this is effectively an component did mount effect. So this function is only going to execute once after the initial render. And what we're going to do is we are going to listen for an event to happen. So we're going to call this test because we want to test to see if this is working or not. And we'll get back a message from the server. And all we'll do is print out that message. Okay, so pretty easy setup on the front end. Let's save it. Hit Control B. Let's go to app.js on the server side. And we already set this up, IO server here. Now we just need to use it. So let's come down here. And let's close that out. Now what I could do is say io.on connect. So whenever there's a connection happening, this is going to fire off this function and we should get back the socket. Next, all we need to do is we need to emit an event. So I could say socket.emit test, and I am going to pass in the message. So this is from the server. Okay, so socketio works like event-driven programming. I give it something to listen for, so a connection. So once I connect from the client, this is going to get invoked. So this function here, because of this connect. And then all I'm going to do is emit this test here. Okay, and here, this is the example message. All right, so let's actually test this out. Let's bring up the terminal. And we're going to need 2 terminals. So right now, this is on client. So let's just run the start script here. But on the second one, let's clear it. We're going to say node app to run the server. Okay, so we run the server, open this command prompt, and we are going to run the start script. Okay, so here we go. We get this. And there you go. So we get our message. This is from the server. Okay, so our socketio stuff is working. So let's close all this for now. So now let's go ahead and create our create game component. So let's bring up the Explorer. We're going to go within our components folder, right click, new file, and we'll call this create game. Okay. So let's do all the boring React stuff. So import React, and we're also going to pull out the use state from React. We're also going to need to import our socket config file. And we'll just set up our create game component. All right, so now from here, let us set up a state called nickname. And this is going to be what the user wants to call himself. And we'll say use state, and we will initialize that to an empty string. Next, let's go over how our create game component is going to look like. So let's take a look at the JSX. The first thing we're going to do is we need a row. Next, let's set up our bootstrap grid. And we'll make this column of small. Let's make 3 copies of this. And the middle one, we'll set that to 8. Okay, so we'll put everything inside of here. Next, let's get a title. So we'll say a h1 tag. And we'll give this a class name of text center. And we'll just call this create game. Next, let's set up our form. And we don't need an action, but we will need an onSubmit. And we'll set that to our onSubmit function. So we haven't created this yet, but we will. Next, let's create a form group. And we should have a label. And this label is going to be for our nickname. And we'll just say enter nickname. Next, we need our input. And we are going to give it a name prop of nickname. And the value, and we're going to set this to the state. All right, so next we need to define a couple more props. So I'm just going to give us more space. And the next prop we're going to define is our onChange. So again, we haven't created our onChange function, but we will. Next, we're going to give it a placeholder. And let us just say enter nickname. And finally, we are going to give it a class name of form control. Okay, so that's all for our input. Next, we need a button. And we're going to make this of type submit. And we will style this button. So we're just going to make this a primary button. Okay, and we'll give it a text of submit. Let's get rid of that space. Okay, so this is good. We're going to have to define our onChange, and we're going to have to define our onSubmit. Okay, so let's come up here and let's define our onChange first. So const onChange. We're going to get the event object. And all we're going to do is set the nickname to whatever the target is. So e.target.value. Okay, so that's going to update every time someone types within our input field. Next, let's give us some more space. Next, let's define our onSubmit. So I'm just going to say const onSubmit. And we should get back the event object again. We want to prevent the default from happening. And what we're going to do is use our socket. So we're just going to say socket.emit, and we are going to say create game. And we're just going to pass in the nickname. Okay, so again, we're emitting an event, create game. So now we need to go back to the server side and we need to listen for this event. Okay, so let us, for now, let's save this. Let's go to our app.js on the client side. Let us import this. So we'll say import create game. And this should be in our components folder. And we'll call this create game. Okay. So we will save this for now. And let's head over to the server side. Okay. So we'll get rid of this. We don't need this. And now what we could do is we could listen for that event to occur. So I could say socket.on, and we called it create game. And we could get the data that the client is sending us. So I'm going to make an async function, and we are going to get back the nickname. Okay, and you'll see why we're using async. We're going to make some asynchronous calls here. So let's use a try catch block. And we'll just print out the error if anything goes wrong. And within here, let us use our quotable API. So we're going to get the sentence that we want our players to type out. So I'm just going to say const quotable data. And we are just going to await quotable API. And we're going to call that. So I covered this within the first video. So this is going to give us the words that our players need to type out. Next, let's create a game object. So I'm going to say let game equal to new game. We are now going to set game.words to the data that we fetched. So quotable data. Next, what we need to do is actually create a player. So I'm going to say let player. And our player is going to have a socket ID. And we're just going to say socket.id. So this socket is from here. So remember I said that every socket has its own unique ID. So we're setting that here. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to say is party leader. We're going to set this to true. And this is because this player is the one who created this game. Next, we're just going to pass in the nickname, whatever he wants to be called. Next, we need to add this player to the game. So we'll just say game.players.push. And afterwards, we are just going to save the game. And there's one more thing that we need to do. And we need to create a room for all our sockets within our game. So in order to do that, we're going to use the primary key from our game object. So I'm just going to say const game ID. It's going to be equal to game._ID. This is going to give me the primary key, but we need this in a string format. This is going to give us an object ID object. So what we're going to do is just call our toString method. And then next, what we're going to do is make our socket join that game. So in order to do that, we'll just say socket.join, and we'll pass in the game ID. So now our socket is within the game room. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to tell our IO server to send this to every socket within this room. So I'm just going to say io.to, and we're going to say game ID. And we are going to emit update game. And we're just going to pass our game that we just created. Okay. So this is going to say, hey, I want you to look within this room, this game ID, which should be unique. And I want you to emit this event update game and just pass in the game. Okay. So this looks good. So we're going to need to go back to our app.js on the front end. So let's copy that. And we are just going to get rid of this. And we'll say socket.on. We'll say update game. And we should get the game back. And for now, let's just print out the game. And we are also going to set the state. Now, I haven't created the state yet, but we'll do that shortly. So we'll just say set game state. And we'll set that to the game. All right. So let us come up here. We're going to bring in use state hook. Let me just copy that. And up here, let's declare our game state. So I'm just going to say const. We'll say game state. We'll say set game state. And we'll say use the state. Now within here, we are just going to give some default values. So ID is going to be empty. Is open is going to be false. Players is going to be an empty array. And words is also going to be an empty array. Okay. So that's going to be our initial game state. Once update game is called, we'll set it here. And from here, what I want to do is actually navigate to the type racer component. Now, we haven't created the type racer component, but we will. So what I need to do is go here. So we're just going to say history.push, and we are just going to go to that page. So I'm going to say game, and we are just going to say game ID. Now, there is one problem with this. So whenever you're setting the state, this is an asynchronous event. So this is not synchronous. So what I need to do before I navigate to the game page is I need to make sure that this game state has been loaded. So what we're going to do is we're not going to put the history.push here. We're going to use effect again. So we'll say use effect. Give it a function. And this time within the dependency array, we'll pass in game state dot underscore ID. Okay. Now within here, what we could do is have an if statement, and we can say if the game state dot underscore ID does not equal to an empty string, that means, hey, we've successfully updated the game. Now go to the game page. So let us copy this, actually get rid of that. And we are just going to paste that here. And this should be game state dot underscore ID. So that's where we're going to go once the game state loads. Okay. And before I forget, within this use effect, let's give us some space here. We need to clean up. So once our component unmounts, we are going to run this function. And all we're going to do is remove the listeners off our socket. Okay. So we have done a lot. We need to set up our create game route. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll say route and the path that we want. And the component is the create game component. Okay, so now is the moment of truth. Does this all work? So let us save this. Let's open a terminal. And what we need to do is restart our server. And it should work. Let's test this out. Okay, so this is what we get back. We go to create game. Our component renders. Next, we type a nickname. Let's hit submit. And there you go. So I'm going to hit F12. So we get our object back. That's good. So this is what the server sends us. Our player gets created. And we get navigated to the game page after we set the game state. So everything is working according to plan. So we successfully finished the create game portion, and within the upcoming tutorial, we're going to work on the join game functionality.